Hello everyone and welcome back to another exciting episode of Building Subtxt. I'm your host, Jim Hull. I love great stories and I built an application to help make more of them. As always, if you'd like to learn more about any of the concepts that you learn about in this video, feel free to visit Subtxt University at narrativefirst.com/Subtxt University. Today, I want to go over how you can find the source of conflict in your main character throughline. Now, if you haven't seen this video right here, finding the source of conflict in your objective story throughline, you might want to check it out first because it lays down all the foundational elements and concepts you should know. I'll go over it a little bit here at the very beginning, but if you haven't seen that video yet, I definitely would check it out first. And if you have seen it, well, let's get started. Well, if you've been around the Subtxt community long enough, you know that there are 4 throughline that make up a complete story. There's the objective story throughline, the main character throughline, the obstacle character throughline, and the relationship story throughline. Well, today I want to talk about the main character throughline and what sets that apart from the objective story throughline. This is something that is actually quite difficult to train out of a large language model, as it's been trained on all the kind of confusing, more subjectively oriented points of view when it comes to storytelling and creative writing that's out there on the internet. It's actually a relatively difficult thing to train out of the model. The most obvious place where you will see this is when it conflates the idea of the protagonist with the main character. In subtext, the protagonist is not necessarily always the main character. The protagonist is an objective function found in the objective story throughline. So the protagonist is the one who pursues the goal. The main character throughline is that up-close and personalized view of conflict that you find in a complete story. It represents what personal baggage the main character brings into the story, not necessarily what they're trying to do or what they're trying to accomplish. Sometimes they are in the same player. So sometimes you will have the same player representing both protagonist and main character. And that's when you find the hero. But there are lots of stories where that's split. And the reason why this is important is because there's plenty of times in our lives when we're not the ones in charge, when we're not the ones driving things, and we're just kind of on the sidelines watching things happen. The Shawshank Redemption is a great example of this, where the protagonist of the story is Andy Dufresne, but the main character is Red. We're not talking about the storytelling device that is the narrator. We're talking about that first-person point of view where there's some personal baggage that we as the audience can attach ourselves to because we know what it feels like to be in that position. And sure, we might go ahead and do all the things that we would do out in the objective story, but you really need to have that main character through line in order to give your audience something to empathize with. In my years working with creative writers, I've found that the main character through line is actually the most difficult one for people to write. They can do really well with the obstacle character through line because they can write about other people's problems really easily. But when it comes to the main character through line, because confidentially, it's almost always about the author themselves, the degree to which that through line is represented successfully is how honest and open and vulnerable the author can be. That's why the main character through line is so important. Because if the author doesn't care enough to bring themselves into the story, why should the audience care? Now, just like I did with the objective story throughline video, where I went through and found 4 different examples of sources of conflict in the objective story throughline, today I want to do the same thing, but just for the main character throughline. I'm going to go over Poor Things, Oppenheimer, Past Lives, and American Fiction. When you look at Poor Things, and you can make it past the music, you'll find that Bella Baxter has a main character throughline set in universe. This one is usually the easiest one to explain, especially in a story that's a little more fantastical like this. She is defined by the fact that she has a baby brain inside of her head. That is a universe domain problem. You can say that the domain of the main character throughline defines who they are. It's all about her journey from rebirth with that infant's mind to her struggle for autonomy in the outside world. That universe domain is frequently illustrated as a fish out of water. So she's definitely a stranger in a strange land trying to figure out where she fits into the world. but because all of us have had some sort of experience with what it feels like to be a stranger and to be perhaps not in the body that we are in, or perhaps to be inside of a body that we're not in, or to feel alienated from our own physicality. That's why we have the universe domain for exploring those issues in the main character through line. Now, with Mr. Oppenheimer, it's interesting because his whole problem is grappling with the profound ethical implications of his study. And he does that through the domain of physics, which is really interesting because he's very concerned with how physics actually work. It's an interesting twist on that idea of having a domain of physics and it also being his area of study. Can you hear the music, Robert? That is somebody who is investigating and doing all these things to come to an understanding of how the universe works. And that's the personal through line that we get to experience within that film. We get to go through and see what it feels like to hear the music, to be there, to be someone driven to accomplish all these great things, and then eventually find out that maybe we did too much. Now, the next one is super interesting, and I didn't realize I did this when I picked the 4 examples, but both Poor Things and Past Lives are very different narrative structures from Oppenheimer and American fiction. Stories about characters that are set out on an intention, that are moving towards trying to figure out how things work and how things fit together, and not really trying to solve anything, which is the exact opposite, certainly for Oppenheimer. Well, with Past Lives, it's all about Nora and her grappling with this idea of the past and the present, all the decisions that she makes that challenge her and showcase what it's like to work through how you go about thinking about things like you would in a main character through line domain of psychology. Throughout the story, she's always wrestling with the thoughts of her former life and the love that she left behind in Seoul, and that's juxtaposed about her life in New York. It's not about the fact that she's separated. She's in New York and for whatever reason, she's not in Seoul. That would be more of a universe. It's really about her trying to figure out who I am and who are the people that I'm supposed to be with and how can I reconcile that with the circumstances of my life. Now, this one is interesting because if you have seen that video about Objective Story Throughline, you know that I talked about the worst person in the world, which is kind of sort of similar story in that Julie is trying to figure out where she fits in. Well, in the worst person in the world, that is what the whole story is about. Everybody is affected by those psychological dependencies, and the relationships are defined by that. Instead of psychology being explored in the interpersonal relationships that you find in the worst person in the world, in Past Lives, it's really an intimate exploration of what it means to figure out where you fit in. Did I make the right choices or did I not? But on a very personal and on a very quiet level. And then finally, we get to American fiction and its focus on a main character through line in the domain of mind. So it's about what he thinks. Monk, the Jeffrey Wright character in the film, is completely obsessed with racist attitudes towards him, prejudice, and disgust and contempt with where people are taking literature. And it's very much just his problem. His agent, everybody else is like, just go with it, do this sort of thing. His brother is like, come on, man, have a good time. And he's just like, oh, I can't believe people think this way. What people think is a huge problem for him. And what other people think of him is a huge problem for him. He has this ego and this arrogance that is there and defines who he is in American fiction. He's not concerned with people looking at him and just judging him on the color of his skin. He's beyond that. And it's not the things that he's doing that are causing problems just for him. And he's not trying to figure out where he fits in like Past Lives. He really just has this bad attitude. And a lot of the comedy that comes out of it is his ultimate contempt and just negative feelings towards what it is that he's asked to do. Just like I did in that video again, Objective Story Throughline, trying to find the conflict in there. Make sure you check it out. There is a question that you can ask yourself to make sure that you're identifying the right source of conflict for the different through lines. And the question is, if you think that this is where your main character is situated, just ask yourself, okay, if the properties of that were removed from the story, would this main character still have some sort of inequity? Would there still be some problem? And if the answer is yes, then you probably haven't correctly identified it yet. If the answer is no, then yeah, you hit it right down the line. You got it. For instance, Bella Baxter in Poor Things, if she didn't have a baby brain inside her head and she wasn't walking around like that, she wouldn't have any problem. She could just do whatever she wants, and then not everybody would be trying to control her and get what they want out of her. That's why she's in the universe domain. For Oppenheimer, I mean, come on. If he just stopped trying to listen to the music and stopped trying to figure out how everything works, then we wouldn't be in the situation that we all are in right now. If he had just stopped doing all the things that he was doing, then he wouldn't have that feeling at the end, that great close-up shot of him where he's like, oh, I think I've destroyed the world. If he hadn't done all that stuff, if he had engaged in all those physics, then there wouldn't be any story. That was the story that Nolan was exploring in Oppenheimer. Again, with past lives, if Nora didn't really think through and come up with all these what-if scenarios and really try to piece together, what does it mean that Sung is back in my life? What does that mean that I got married to Arthur? How do all these things fit together? If she would just have some sort of certainty in her life and not trying to figure out what all of this means and put all these things together, well, you wouldn't have the beautiful film that you have with past lives. And again, with American fiction, if Monk just had a better attitude and he wasn't so obsessed with integrity and respect, then well, he wouldn't be the same character. That's why you want to try and find where the source of conflict is. What is your main character through line exploring? Because that defines the character, that defines the experience for the audience. If you remove that, then you don't have Monk, you don't have the greatness that is American fiction, and it wouldn't have been up for Best Picture. So that's it for the exploration of finding the source of conflict in your main character through line. In the next video, what I'll do is I'll take a look at the obstacle character through line, which is a completely different experience than the main character through line. But until then, if you had any questions about the main character through line, like I said, it's one of those things that is the most difficult thing for authors to put into their story, because it's all a representation of how vulnerable and open they can be to expressing what is really going on inside of them. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, please leave them down below. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.